Hello and welcome to Buy the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our course on truth, justice, and leadership, and we're turning to Plato's dialogue, Gorgias. In the first part of our course, we looked at the political thought of Niccolò Machiavelli. And in a nutshell, Machiavelli argues that human nature is fundamentally selfish or acquisitive, that the purpose of our lives is to satisfy desires. We can categorize people in basically two types. One is the people who desire to be left alone and enjoy their comforts in security and pleasure. And the prince or the great, those who are competing for power, and they desire power above all, and they're willing to take the risks for that. So the formula that Machiavelli gives us for politics is basically that the prince consolidates power by the ruthless elimination of competitors, and he justifies this by saying that he's protecting the people and enabling them to satisfy their desires for comfort and pleasure and security. And for him, this is the ideal formula for the maximization of governmental power and stability of the political regime. Next, we turned to Alexis de Tocqueville. He's writing in the 1830s after having visited America. He's from France. And we see that he is indirectly criticizing this Machiavellian paradigm. He sees it in operation in America. Not that Americans are purely Machiavellian, but he can see the spirit and the pragmatism, the materialism, and things of that nature in the way that we look at everything in terms of self-interest. Even when we're doing good, it's in our own interest to do that. And he analyzes this and he finds that America is presenting, if you will, the best version of this Machiavellianism, the one that is most, peaceful and benign. But at the same time, he wants to emphasize that this is not true to human nature. There is more to human nature than what Machiavelli is accounting for. In other words, there's more than selfish desires. There are what he calls disinterested desires, desires for what is true, good, and beautiful. And he illustrates this in various ways. And as we got to the end of those readings in Tocqueville, we saw that Tocqueville was suggesting that if we want to really delve into the nature of these disinterested desires, of these higher goods that are being neglected in the modern world, then we need to turn to Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher. So that's what we're going to do next in this course. So who was Plato? Very briefly, we're going to look at the author here and a couple of other historical figures that are relevant to what we're going to look at. Plato, as noted, an ancient Greek author. He was notable for many things. His name Plato actually means broad-shouldered, and it was a nickname. It's not his given name, a nickname that he earned as a wrestler. So that was one of his excellences, was as a wrestler. Another was that he was a playwright. So if you think of ancient Greek drama, Sophocles, for example, or Aristophanes, Plato was kind of following in their footsteps. He was a very talented and was probably going to be a very famous playwright. But he ran into an individual named Socrates, and we'll look at Socrates in just a minute. Socrates is the main character in most of Plato's dialogues. Socrates was not the first philosopher in history, but Socrates is usually identified as being a very crucial, revolutionary kind of philosopher, specifically that he began to systematically apply philosophical methods of reasoning to ethical and political problems. So you could say that Socrates is the first, or at least one of the first, political philosophers in history. And Plato was so taken by what Socrates was doing that it changed his life. He dropped everything else. He stopped writing plays, and he only started writing dialogues, philosophical dialogues. And as noted, he wrote about 30 or so of them, and Socrates was the main character in most of those. If you look through the dialogues, you could see Socrates from being a young man, where he is listening to other philosophers and kind of figuring out what philosophy is about, all the way to the point where Socrates is an old man and he's put on trial for offending the authorities in Athens, and he is found guilty and he's sentenced to death. And Plato writes all the way up to the point where Socrates drank the hemlock, the poison that was administered to him by the authorities, and died. So we get basically an overview of the life of Socrates in Plato's writings. There's a lot more we could say about Plato, but let's take a look at who Socrates is, because we're going to be hearing a lot from him. Unlike Plato, Socrates did not write anything. We have no writings of Socrates. We know about him through Plato and through a couple of other people who knew him and wrote about him. And of course, over the generations to follow, Socrates was written about a lot. But in terms of the firsthand accounts, we have some of his students. We also have Aristophanes, the playwright, who wrote comedies. He wrote a comedy that was making fun of Socrates. So we get a somewhat different picture of Socrates through Aristophanes' ridicule of him. So as a historical figure, Socrates is pivotal, but it's very interesting that it is through other people that we know about him. He spent his life, literally walking around, the streets of Athens and conversing with people. He was not a high aristocrat. He was a free citizen, but he was born into a family of masons. There's no evidence from what we know about him that he ever actually worked at that job. He seems to have spent all of his time philosophizing. As a result, he was poor. He didn't have his own independent wealth, and he wasn't earning much. And it seems like he actually lived off some of his students, who made sure that he could make ends meet and that his wife and children didn't starve. Socrates is a very peculiar figure. We're only going to scratch the surface in terms of looking at him as an individual here in this course. But we mentioned that he was revolutionary in beginning to philosophize about political things. We mentioned that this got him into trouble. So the questions that he was asking about the nature of what is right and wrong, what is true and false, what is good and bad, and how does this apply to the laws and to the political regime, to whoever's in charge and how they should rule. These were questions that were deeply subversive to the authorities of the time. And so Socrates did get away with philosophizing about those things for decades. He spent decades doing it. He wasn't necessarily popular for doing this, and that's one thing we always want to bear in mind in reading about him, is that he had certainly his adoring fans, but he also had plenty of enemies that he made with asking these questions and making these arguments. And we'll get a sense of why that is from the dialogue that we're going to read, because we'll see that what he's arguing against Gorgias and Gorgias's students is something that potentially could be deeply offensive to them. In fact, this dialogue will end with one of those students warning Socrates that you're going to get yourself killed by talking this way. And that something like that happens in most of the dialogues, because Plato is a dramatist, right? He was a playwright, and when he writes these dialogues, he's writing drama. They're not like typical drama. They're philosophical dialogues. They're almost read sometimes like a philosophical treatise, but it is very important as we look at this dialogue to realize that it's a dramatic work. These are characters, even though they're historical characters. It's not entirely clear to what degree Plato is fictionalizing things, but it's certainly apparent that he is doing a certain amount of fictionalization in the way that he portrays these events, and that he's using his dramatic art to create a work of literature in which not only just the arguments that we're going to look at are important, but all of the dramatic details. Who are these people? What's motivating them? Why are they talking about this? Why are they reacting the way that they're reacting? And where does that fit into the bigger picture, both in their own time period of ancient Athens, but going forward, how does that actually relate to the different circumstances that come up throughout history? In particular, our goal is going to be a look at essentially what is a Socratic critique of Machiavelli. Now, how is that possible? This is many, many centuries before Machiavelli was born. As noted in the section of our course on Machiavelli, Machiavelli is certainly not inventing most of the basic ideas that he puts together. His packaging and his marketing, in a sense, I think is unique. What he's doing with it is somewhat new. But the basic ideas that Machiavelli is articulating are not new at all. And we will see that many of those ideas are present in this dialogue. Gorgias is not going to proclaim them very explicitly, but his students are going to very forthrightly make a number of very Machiavellian arguments, and Socrates is going to respond to them. So in a certain sense, this could be taken as the Socratic critique of Machiavelli. And we want to bear in mind, Machiavelli certainly read this and studied this carefully. So when he's presenting these ideas, he's well aware of how and why Socrates had criticized these ideas. So it can lead us into some very interesting kind of loops in terms of thinking of what would Plato say to Machiavelli, what would Machiavelli say back. So that's part of the nature of this course, is that we're going to be comparing and contrasting these ideas. But of course, first we need to delve in and see what's going on in this dialogue. But before we get into the dialogue itself, just a word about one of the main characters in this dialogue. The dialogue is named after an historical figure. This is a man who was from Sicily. He was from a Greek colony in Sicily, which was allied to Athens. His name is Gorgias. And who is this guy? Well, he actually wrote a lot of things. And as Tocqueville had mentioned, a lot of these writings from people other than Plato have not come down to us. When it comes to Gorgias, we have limited selections, mostly quotations from other people who are quoting him, and a few scraps of his own writings. So we don't have as much information directly about Gorgias as we do about, say, like Plato. And this Platonic dialogue, of course, is Plato's response to Gorgias. And when Plato wrote it, the people of the time could have compared this to Gorgias's own writings, and maybe a lot of them knew him. Gorgias had a major influence. He was a rhetorician. That was his main thing. So he practiced rhetoric. He gave a number of famous speeches, and some of his writings were basically extended, essays or arguments, oratorical kind of treatments of certain topics. He sometimes functioned as a diplomat, trying to negotiate among the cities of the time. He also taught rhetoric. So he traveled around to different cities, and that's what's going on in this dialogue. He's visiting Athens, and he is working with his local students in Athens. So he's spending time going through the art of rhetoric with them and teaching them how to be great public speakers. So what is his idea of the art of rhetoric? That's what this dialogue is going to be focused on very heavily. Socrates will be interrogating him, and then through his students probing into, what exactly are you up to with this rhetoric? What is the point of it? And again, directly looking at what Gorgias himself actually taught, it is highly debatable, partly because we have so little of his writings, partly because he is steeped in paradox and irony. So a lot of the things he's saying, it's not clear. Does he believe them? Is it a joke? Is it just a rhetorical exercise that he's, trying to argue something that's absurd or offbeat? So suffice to say, we're not going to try to solve that problem here. We're simply going to look at how does Plato depict Gorgias, just bearing in mind that the people of the time could have compared this to the real guy much better than we can. And as noted, how does this relate within our course to the theme of Plato's response to these ideas that we found in Machiavelli? And as Tocqueville intimated, what this has to teach us about human nature and the human soul. So the dialogue begins with a character named Callicles. Now, Callicles is an interesting character. He's going to turn out to be probably the most outspoken person in this dialogue, other than Socrates himself. Towards the later portion of the dialogue, he's going to come out as a very important figure. Everybody else in this dialogue is a known historical figure. Callicles is the only one that we have no other record. Is he a fictional invention of Plato? That's a possibility. He could simply be a historical person that hasn't been recorded anywhere else by mischance. Another possibility that some scholars have brought up is there some kind of a mysterious connection between Callicles and Plato? Now, how would that be? Plato, again, is the nickname of the author. Plato's actual name was Aristocles, which means famous for the highest virtue. Now, Callicles means famous for the most visible virtue. So that could be a coincidence, but it could also be an inside joke, right? Maybe Callicles represents something like the young Plato. Now, if so, that would be very interesting as we look at this character. It would mean that there was quite a transformation in Plato from when he first met Socrates to when he became, the author of these dialogues. But that's all by the by, just to show that there's so much depth that is going on in these dialogues, so many things to think about in terms of their significance. But the setting here is in Callicles' home. That also, of course, makes him an important person in the dialogue. He's hosting Gorgias, and there's a few other students present that we'll meet a little bit later on. And he is the one who therefore greets Socrates and Chaerephon. Chaerephon is a friend of Socrates that we'll look at in a second here. When they arrive. And Callicles greets them with a joke. He says, "In war and battle, Socrates, this is the way to do your part," they say. Now, the joke is when it comes to war, you want to do your part by showing up late, like after the battle's over. So, it's a joke about cowardice, basically, right? So there's a certain, tension here from the beginning. Socrates shows up and he's late. He missed the show. As we're going to find out, Gorgias was putting on display of his rhetorical power. And that's what Callicles assumes, that, not only he, but anybody else would have been interested in being there for Gorgias putting on his oratory and letting people, soak it in. Okay. After all, what's going on here is that Gorgias is in town and these young men are paying him probably very hefty fees to spend his time teaching them how to speak like he does. So they're really going to want to listen to him speak and see, okay, this is what I would like to be able to do when I learn this. And so Socrates misses out on this. And Socrates says, "Oh my, did we show up too late after the feast," as the saying goes? So he's playing along with this, but let's look carefully because this is going to be, I think, the first real indication in the dialogue of what the dialogue is going to largely be about, which is what is it that Socrates admires? What is it that Socrates desires as opposed to these other people in the dialogue, what they admire and what they desire? And there's a gulf there. There's a conflict. Callicles says, "and very much of a stylish feast at that, because Gorgias laid out a display of many beautiful things for us a little while ago." So just to back up again, they changed from a war to a feast. Now, in a war, you could understand how somebody who's fearful would not want to be there and not want to do his part, right? That's why it takes courage to actually show up and engage in that. But here, a feast, who would want to miss a feast, right? The only reason you would want to miss a feast is if you don't like that kind of food, right? You're not actually attracted to what's there. Callicles obviously is very attracted, and he thought it was a lavish feast. And he uses a very important term, and this term is really going to be central, one of the central terms, and as we can see here, it's kind of the introductory among these central terms that the dialogue is going to look at, and that's the term beautiful. And the translation I'm using is very consistent. Whenever the Greek says takelon or any version of takelon, they translate it as beautiful. Many translations will also translate that word as noble or fine, and certain other variations that indicate, various different permutations in English, different connotations of how something can be attractive or admirable. Okay, but in Greek, there's one term that captures this whole range of phenomena. We're going to be talking about this a lot because this is, again, one of the central terms that's going to be debated. What is tekelon? What is beautiful? What makes something beautiful? What makes something attractive? What makes us desire things? For Machiavelli, it's all about satisfying desires, but he doesn't want to question those desires. Plato, and as we saw with Tocqueville in the whole Socratic view, is that we have to question desires. We have to see, is something actually desirable, and how desirable is it? It's not just how much do we desire it, how worthy is it of desire? And one of the qualities that makes something worthy of being desired is tekelon, the beautiful. If beauty is something to be desired. Beauty has, for Socrates, an objective meaning. But of course, there are different kinds of beauty, and there's different ways that we are attracted to them or not. And so right away here, we can see that Gorgias is raising this question because he speaks in a way that is considered by most people to be very beautiful and very attractive, and they just want to soak it in. But here is Socrates, didn't show up for it. Now, why is that? Well, Socrates blames his friend, Chaerephon. Well, Callicles, Chaerephon here is to blame for that since he made us waste our time in the marketplace. Now, this could be the case, but I want to say a few things from having read a number of Platonic dialogues and from having looked at the whole of this dialogue. Is Socrates may be politely excusing himself here by blaming his friend Chaerephon for this. But I think we're going to find out, first of all, that Socrates was not actually interested in listening to Gorgias' speech. And we can see in this dialogue and all the others, or at least most of the others, that Socrates is a man that, despite his poverty and despite his lack of status within Athenian society, and despite the fact that he's not a rhetorician, he's not a public speaker or anything like that, his words are very powerful. In the dialogue, Socrates ends up steering the conversations in the directions that he wants to go. He ends up having a great deal of power and control over the way these interactions go, even though paradoxically his desire is not for power, his desire is for truth. So there's a kind of paradox there that Plato seems to indicate, is that the one who really pursues truth for its own sake ends up being more powerful than the one who's pursuing power. But be that as it may, Socrates, I don't think he generally is not actually being controlled by other people in the way that he insinuates here with Chaerephon. In other words, if Socrates had wanted to be there for the speech, then most likely he would have been there for the speech. But Chaerephon, who is obviously a good sport about these things, we could say more about Chaerephon. He turns up in Socrates' apology, his defense speech, when he's an old man and he's being tried before being executed. Chaerephon had already died, but he calls Chaerephon as a witness, even though Chaerephon's not alive anymore. And there's a lot we could dig into about Chaerephon. He's kind of an off-the-wall kind of a character. But in this case, let's just say that he is easygoing about this, and he says, "Oh, it's no big deal, Socrates, since I'll provide the cure too, because Gorgias is a friend of mine." Okay, so Chaerephon ends up being the bridge between Socrates and Gorgias. The one who said, "I can guarantee you a private audience with him. You don't have to go to the public speech." So he'll put on display for us now if that seems good, or some other time if you want. Now I'm just going to note in passing that Chaerephon says, "if it seems good." this could be just a casual kind of a thing. But as we're going to see, another central concept of this dialogue that differentiates Socrates from Machiavelli is the concept of the good. So the beautiful and the good, the true, the good, and the beautiful, those are the three transcendentals, as they're often called, the three objects that are worthy of our desire, the highest objects worthy of desire of our desires. So in Socratic thought, it's not just whatever you desire, whatever desire you can satisfy is good. We ought to be desiring what is true, good, and beautiful. And so Chaerephon, I think, is reflecting his familiarity with Socrates and his way of thinking of, this is what we'll do, Socrates, if it seems good. In other words, he knows that Socrates is always going to be asking that question. Is this the good thing, or is something else good? And in this case, Socrates is going to reject this option. So, this is being set up for us as the first major dramatic point, is that Socrates missed the oration of Gorgias. Socrates has a chance to hear an oration of Gorgias, and Socrates is going to say, no thanks. I'm really not interested in hearing this man speak. So one of the greatest orators of history, and Socrates is like, nah, never mind. He has something else that he's much more desirous of. So therefore, Socrates thinks that something else is much more beautiful and more beneficial, a greater good than what Gorgias is doing through his art of rhetoric. So the question, Callicles raises this question, which, as I've already insinuated, the answer is going to be no. What Chaerephon does Socrates have a desire to hear Gorgias? That's kind of the first question of the dialogue, and again, the answer is going to be negative. So Chaerephon thinks the answer is probably yes. I mean, he kind of realized that Socrates might have a different view, but his preference certainly would be to hear it, and so he's going to try to push in that direction. He's like, that's the very thing we're here for, in fact. Callicles says, hey, no problem. He's at my house. Let's go in, and he'll put on a display for you. But Socrates interjects. Socrates says, it's good of you to say, Callicles, but he wants something else. He says, would he be willing to have a conversation with us? So this is the first major, dramatic play in this dialogue. Socrates has an opportunity to hear a speech of Gorgias, and he says, no thanks, how about a conversation instead? So Socrates, what he desires and what he thinks is beneficial is not so much speeches as conversations. Because so what is he going to get out of a conversation? What's the point of that? Because I want to find out from him what power belongs to the man's art and what it is that he lays claim to and teaches. As for the other thing, the display, let him do that some other time, as you say. So why does Socrates desire conversation? It's for learning, for purposes of learning. So can you learn anything from a speech? Certainly. But Socrates appears to think you can learn more from a conversation than a speech, at least in this case. But looking at all the dialogues, we could say that's a general point. Socrates engages in conversations, and he insists on that in these dialogues whenever people want to do anything else. So it's for purposes of learning. And what does Socrates want to learn? There's a very specific thing that he wants to learn, and that's the topic of this dialogue. So Socrates is successful, and I think this is an important thing to bear in mind. Socrates is not a Machiavellian. His idea is not, whatever it takes to get what you desire. But Socrates does get what he desires in this dialogue. He gets a conversation focused on this question, which is, what is the power of rhetoric? He doesn't name rhetoric yet because he's not even going to jump to that conclusion. I mean, anybody would know that Gorgias is a rhetor, and he teaches rhetoric, but Socrates is going to question even that and say, like, what do you call your art? What is it? Where does it come from? But ultimately, his question about it is, what is the power of it? Okay, so this is another thing that we can relate, to Machiavelli. Machiavelli is all about power, how to get power. But one of the things that we're going to see with Socrates is Socrates doesn't jump into this question. For him, it's not all about how to get power. For him, it's actually much more important to say, what is power? Because he's going to ask, okay, what's the power of rhetoric? And as they're trying to answer that, it's going to turn out that they think they know what power is. And Socrates, it's going to be one of his challenges to them is, do you even know what power is? So this is going to be challenging the Machiavellian paradigm all the way down is, okay, you say you want power, but what is that? Have you really thought about what power means in the first place? So we're going to be questioning rhetoric, but as we question the power of rhetoric, we're also going to be looking at even more fundamental questions like what is power in the first place? And it's all going to relate back to the true, the good, and the beautiful. Okay, how does power relate to those more fundamental concepts? So Callicles doesn't, miss a beat here. He's not put off by this. He says there's nothing like asking the man himself, Socrates, because this too was one part of his display. So he's not sure if Gorgias will be up for a conversation, but as far as the topic, he says, yeah, he covered that topic anyhow in his speech. So if you want to converse with him about it, let's see. Let's ask if he's willing to do that. And he notes that part of Gorgias, and this was in fact part of Gorgias's rhetorical style, is that he invited questions. In fact, he would brag that people could ask whatever they wanted, and he would answer on any subject. As we'll see, that's going to be a really important thing that Socrates is going to question him about. How could you do that? How could you answer questions on any subject? What does that imply about Gorgias that he thinks he can do that? And that he gets away with it as well. So Socrates' response is beautiful. Chaerephon, you ask him, because remember, Chaerephon already knows him and can be a liaison. So what's beautiful about this? Again, it's an important word for Socrates, is that, he's looking, for something here in this conversation. The possibility that the conversation could happen, perhaps, is something that attracts him, that he's attracted to. But Chaerephon is not really sure what to do at this point, right? I mean, this wasn't what Chaerephon thought, that they were going to come and get a speech. So now Socrates wants something else. And I don't think it's because Chaerephon is not familiar with Socrates' conversation. He's probably seen a lot of them, right? So it probably has more to do with, he's probably wondering, is Gorgias really going to go for that? Is that really going to be Gorgias' style? He's probably sensing that there's going to be a clash between them, and he's hesitating. What am I going to ask him? It's like, this wasn't what I planned. This wasn't what I was looking forward to here. And Socrates says, well, who he is. And Chaerephon doesn't get that. He's like, what do you mean? He's Gorgias. Everybody knows who the guy is. And Socrates says, no, I'm talking about his art, okay? If somebody happened to be a craftsman who made shoes, then you said, okay, who are you, or what kind of art do you have? He would say he's a leather worker. That's what he has expertise in. And so Chaerephon says, okay, I get it. So this is what we're going to ask Gorgias is, obviously, again, he's a rhetorician, but Socrates is not making any assumptions about this. He's indicating that there's some kind of radical doubt that he has about the whole nature of what Gorgias is up to. And so rather than starting with any assumptions about it, he's going to go right to the bottom and say, okay, what are you doing? How would you describe what you're doing in terms of an art, in terms of power? And let me just pause for a second and look at the term art, because this is a very crucial term. We see in the first example of an art that's mentioned here is leather working. So what does he mean by an art? Techne in the Greek, it's where we get the word technology. A techne means practical knowledge. So both sides of this are important. It has to be a practical thing. It produces some kind of product in a reliable manner with reliable parameters, quality, properties. That's why it's associated with power, because it can actually do something. It can accomplish something. But it's a practical knowledge. So it means that, first of all, it's something that somebody learns, that nobody's born knowing how to do this. You have to learn it, and you can teach it. It's something that is it has a conceptual component as well as a practical component, and it can be learned, it can be passed on. And Gorgias looks like that because, he's not only doing rhetoric, but he's teaching it as well. And Socrates is going to try to get to the bottom of, okay, what are you doing and what are you teaching people? So Chaerephon, being a good friend of Socrates here, he's going to do his best to try to set this up for Socrates' enjoyment or profit. And he says, tell me, Gorgias, is Callicles here telling the truth that you claim to answer whatever anyone asks you? And Gorgias says, it's true, Chaerephon. I was just now making that very claim, and I tell you, for many years, no one has ever asked me anything new. So you see his supreme confidence. He is not worried that anybody's going to ask him a question that he can't answer. Now, as we're going to see very quickly in this dialogue, Gorgias is going to bow out of the conversation. He's going to retreat. He's going to be uncomfortable answering Socrates' questions. So this is very significant. For many, many years, nobody has come up with any question that stumped Gorgias. But very soon here, Socrates is going to start stumping him so hard that he's going to try to wiggle out of it. And Chaerephon says, I suppose that you give answers with ease, Gorgias. And Gorgias says, open to you to put that to the test, Chaerephon. He's not worried. No fears of public speaking or anything like that here with this guy. But now we get an interruption, and this is from one of the students of Gorgias, Polus. And Polus, as we're going to see, he's an eager beaver. He is a student, and he wants to put this to use. So he's going to try to use Socrates' curiosity as an opportunity to show off what he has been learning from Gorgias. And in fact, Gorgias is going to give him a chance to do that pretty soon. But here he says, if that's what you want, Chaerephon, test me by Zeus. So he's very, he's swearing here by Zeus. He is really eager. He's really insistent. Gorgias seems to me to be worn out since he's just gone through a lot of answers. Chaerephon says, what, Polus? Do you suppose you'd give answers more beautifully than Gorgias would? So here's the word beautiful again. The context is we're trying to entice Socrates with something that's very beautiful. Socrates didn't want to go for a speech. He wants a conversation. But Chaerephon is saying, gee, Polus, I don't think he really considers a conversation with you to be as beautiful, as attractive as a conversation with your teacher, Gorgias. Polus, though, you can see he's trying to imitate his teacher in his self-confidence, among other things. He is going to project confidence that he can do at least good enough, right? He's not going to say he's as good as Gorgias, but he says, what does it matter as long as I answer well enough for you? There could be, this could be one of the signs that we're seeing that Socrates, again, he's not a man of wealth. He's not a man of rank or status. So even though he does have some admirers in Athens, the general impression that he gives is not necessarily an impressive one. When people look at him or they don't know him too well, especially, they think this guy seems like a shady character, maybe. So it's like, yeah, I think it's going to be good enough for this for you people. And Chaerephon says, I guess it doesn't matter. So go ahead and show us what you got, Polus. So Chaerephon asked the question that we saw, okay, what is this art that you're learning from Gorgias? And let's take a look at how Polus answers, because remember, this is his imitation of Gorgias. And this is part of the drama here, is that we don't get to hear Gorgias give any kind of a speech. We're being kind of played with, what would it sound like for Gorgias to give a speech? And we get his student butting in and saying, I'm going to show you what it's like because I'm learning this. So this is an imitation of Gorgias that we're getting from Polus. There are many arts among human beings, Chaerephon, that have been discovered experientially from experiences. For experience makes our lifespan pass along the path of art, but inexperience along the path of chance. So you notice how we're very far from any kind of a direct answer here, right? What kind of art are you doing? Oh, well, there are many arts. And where do arts come from? They come from experience. And arts are different from chance. All of that is interesting, but it's not really answering the question, right? And of the sorts of arts, various people partake of various ones in various ways, the best partaking of the best. So some arts are better than others. Gorgias here is one of these and partakes of the most beautiful of the arts. So we come back around to beauty. Now, I won't suggest that this is all empty, information. That actually, where does art come from? How are the arts categorized and ranked? These are all interesting questions that we could explore about art, techne. And they're no doubt part of what Plato's doing here is introducing these questions to us so we can think about them. But again, we can see that Paulus, and by implication Gorgias, is not really answering the questions. How is he able to answer questions no matter what from anybody? Maybe part of it is he's not really answering the questions. He's just kind of saying a bunch of stuff that sounds impressive and sounds good. And then people don't realize, because they're so enticed, this is a good place to mention that one of the things that the real Gorgias said is he said words are like drugs. If you know how to use words, it's like you're drugging somebody. So just imagine somebody asks you a question and you give them a drug. What is that going to do? It's going to distract them. They're not going to notice that you didn't answer the question. And he brings it around at the end to the beautiful. And we've already seen that Socrates is interested in the beautiful. And so this is another important thing to see about rhetoric. The rhetoric that Gorgias practices is one of the methods is maybe distracting people. And another method is you tell them what they want to hear. So if you know somebody's interested in beauty, talk about beauty. And in this case, he's going to say, oh, what art is this? It's the most beautiful art, knowing that Socrates and Chaerephon are looking for beauty. Oh, it's the most beautiful art. But is that going to satisfy Socrates? Yeah, of course, not a chance, right? He wants an actual answer to his question. And so he says, no one asked what sort of thing Gorgias' art might be among all these different arts. It's the most beautiful, but what it is and what one ought to call Gorgias. So he points out, you didn't even give me the name of the art, much less tell me what it actually is. Like, what exactly are you doing with this art? And so basically Socrates says, hey, let's cut past the middleman here and let's go to the actual teacher of the art. Gorgias, tell us yourself what we should call you for being knowledgeable in what art. Well, maybe Paulus was imitating Gorgias in his refusal to give a direct answer. But as we're going to see here, Gorgias, even though his normal style might be to avoid giving direct answers, he's going to take a stab at giving direct answers because he can tell that's what Socrates wants, and he's going to give it a try. So he says, rhetoric, Socrates. Okay, that's a simple. This is what we call rhetoric. Then we should call you a rhetorician. And he says, a good one too, Socrates, if you want to call me what I flaunt myself to be, as Homer says. So we can see the humor. And Gorgias is a man who kind of makes fun of himself a little bit. He's like, oh yeah, and I consider myself to be a good rhetorician, right? He does, obviously, but he can also joke about it and quote Homer as, kind of making fun of that kind of boastfulness that he himself practices. And Socrates, I do want to call you that. So there's something that Socrates is really interested in. This is pretty high pressure. Socrates is like, I want to call you what you are. I want to find out what you're up to. And Gorgias says, okay, Socrates, go ahead. You can call me that if you want to, right? But where's this going? And of course, we've already seen Socrates said he wants to know what the art's all about, what it can accomplish, and so forth. So Socrates says, shall we say that you're capable of making other rhetoricians too? As noted, that's part of what an art is something that you can learn and something you can teach. So you're good at it. That's great. Can you teach other people? And clearly the answer is going to be yes, because he has students around him, okay? I make exactly that claim, not only here, but also in other places. He travels all around. People pay him lots of money to learn what his art. So he's got plenty of evidence to back up that he's good and that he can teach it to other people. So now we're going to get into it. Socrates says, let's get to it. You claim you're knowledgeable in the art of rhetoric and could make another person a rhetorician too. What exactly among the things there are is rhetoric about? So if you were making shoes, you were teaching the art of shoemaking or leather working, you could be pretty specific about what you make. You make shoes, you make other leather clothing or objects. So what now, we have already seen that Gorgias, in a certain sense, is very non-specific. He said, you could ask me a question about anything and I'll answer it. That's pretty non-specific, right? And that's going to be a major weakness. But to begin with, he gives a really good attempt to be specific and clear. He says of speeches. Now, this is another term that I want to highlight. Speeches, logoi in the Greek. Logos is the singular. Logos is one of the most important words in ancient Greek, in Plato. It means speech, but it means many other things, has a broad range of meanings. The most other important meaning of logos is reason. So this word, we could, in the context, speeches is certainly the right translation because he's a man who makes speeches and he teaches people how to make speeches. Okay, but the word itself, he could be saying that I'm an expert in reasonings. I'm an expert in how to reason about things, right? So let's keep that in mind because this is what Socrates is primarily focused on in life, is reasoning about things, but he likes to reason about things through conversation rather than speeches. What difference does that make? And this is exactly where Socrates is going to go with this. Okay, you say speeches, reasonings. What sort of speeches or reasonings, Gorgias? The ones that point out to sick people how to lead their lives so they can become healthy? So Socrates points out something very interesting, which is, well, people use speech for a lot of things. They use reasoning for a lot of different things. So let's say you're sick and you want to talk about how do I get better? Who are you going to go to? A rhetorician? The rhetorician's going to explain to you how to get better because he's a master of speeches. He's a master of talking. Doesn't really make sense, right? Well, what's missing? Because there's an art to how to get better when you're sick, and that's called medicine. And who knows how to speak or reason about getting better when you're sick? That would be a doctor, right? Somebody who practices medicine. And you could go through many different things. Let's say you want to know how to, how to grow corn and successfully. Are you going to go to a rhetorician? No, I mean, you can talk to somebody about that. You can reason about that, but you're going to go to a farmer, right? You're not going to go to a rhetorician. So and this is what happens when you have conversations with Socrates. You think you know the answer to something. You think it's a good answer. It sounds good. Socrates pokes holes in it. Says, like, this doesn't really answer the question. Rhetoric isn't about all speeches, right? Because there's many speeches that you're not going to go to a rhetorician for that. And Gorgias has to admit that's true. So tell me, what is it among the things there are that these speeches that rhetoric employs are about? Now, the things that are, that's an important expression here. That has to do with the true. So we've seen the beautiful, we've seen the good, and this is the true. So these three things are going to keep coming up. In other words, when you speak, we can talk about, is the speech beautiful? We can also talk about, is it good? Is it beneficial? Are you doing good with this speech? But finally, we can say, is the speech true? Are you telling the truth? Do you even know what the truth is? Do you even know what you're talking about, right? So those are the three main questions that Socrates is going to be interested in with speeches. Are they beautiful? Are they beneficial? Are they true? And Gorgias is going to make a bold claim here, and this is going to be sort of his downfall, ultimately, in this dialogue, is that He is going to try to rescue himself here from the vagueness of his answers. I'm about speeches without really being able to say what. Speeches about what? About the greatest things, the most important topics, the things that matter the most. Now, one way you could put this would be wisdom. And just to back up for a minute, Socrates is a philosopher. What is philosophy? Philosophy is the love of wisdom, effectively meaning the pursuit of wisdom, because unless we're actually wise and we love wisdom, then we have to search for it. So in effect, that's what Socrates considers philosophy is, the lifelong devoting your life to seeking wisdom. And here Gorgias is saying, I'm a master of the speeches about the things that matter the most. Well, wisdom could be defined as knowledge of the things that matter the most. So if Gorgias knows how to speak about the things that matter the most, he has to be wise. And this is exactly what happens to the main interlocutors in most of the dialogues, is that one way or the other, they think they're wise, and Socrates questions their wisdom, and he finds out that they are not actually wise. They cannot give a satisfactory account. That's another translation of logos, by the way, speech, reason, or account. They can't give a satisfactory account or speech or reasoning about the wisdom that they supposedly have. So we're going to close with looking at one last exchange here between Socrates and Gorgias. Socrates says, so come on, Gorgias, answer what this is that you claim is the greatest good for human beings and claim that you're a craftsman of. So he says, hey, you claim to be wise. You claim to know the greatest good for human beings. So if that's what you talk about and you're an expert in that, tell me, what is the greatest good for human beings? Where, give me your wisdom. Show me your wisdom. Show me how you understand the meaning of life, the purpose of human life, because that's what Gorgias has basically boxed himself into claiming, that he knows the meaning of life. How is he going to answer this? It's the very thing that is in truth the greatest good, Socrates, and the thing that's responsible not only for being free for human beings themselves, but also for their ruling others, each in his own city. So there's an interesting thing here is that what Gorgias is doing, as we're going to see, is he's going to take this as an opportunity to make a sale, so to speak. Right? Instead of actually saying, okay, here's my wisdom, here's what is the greatest good for human beings. He's going to say, oh, what's the greatest good for human beings? Rhetoric. That's what I teach. It's the greatest good, right? So he's just going to try to use this as a way to slip his own product into the mix. But why is rhetoric the greatest good? How would he explain that? He's explaining it by saying rhetoric enables you to be free and it enables you to rule over others. So if we were to plug this, and we're anticipating here the direction this is going to go, in the Machiavellian direction, that Gorgias and his students assume that the meaning of life is to satisfy your desires. And what do people want? Well, they want to be left alone or free to do whatever they want to, but they want to be able to control others and have power. Those are the things that we tend to desire. And rhetoric is a way of getting that. And Socrates says, so what are you saying? What is this? I'm saying that it's being able to persuade people by speeches. So it's through persuasion that you can obtain your own freedom to do what you want, and you can control other people, make them do what you want. For example, he says, jurors in a law court. So somebody's on trial. You're on trial. You can defend yourself and get away. Somebody else is on trial. They're your friend. You can get them off. If it's your enemy, you could get them locked up, right? Legislators in a council chamber. So the law, which governs us, and it could make our life easier, it can make our life harder. You can control the law because you can persuade the lawmakers to make the laws any way that you want them to make those laws. Those assembled in a deliberative assembly and in every other gathering, whatever civic gathering may occur. So you notice that he's presupposing and this is in the context of ancient democracy, that there's a political system in which people debate things and vote on things. He's saying if you have the power of persuasion, and that's what rhetoric, he's presenting rhetoric as the ability to persuade people, ability to get people to think what you want them to think and to do what you want them to do. And if you have that ability, you can indirectly control everything, because you go to whoever has the power, you persuade them to think what you want and do what you want, and then you can piggyback on their power. So Gorgias is not a prince in the same sense of Machiavelli. He is not himself competing to be the ruler, trying to be the ruler, but he is somebody who thinks you don't need to, because if you have the power of rhetoric, you can go and control the ruler, and then the ruler controls everybody else, and then indirectly you're in control. So in this sense, it is a very Machiavellian formula that he's giving. And in fact, he says, with this power, you'll have the doctor as a slave, and the trainer as a slave, and that businessman will be shown up as doing business for someone else and not for himself, namely for you, for the one with the power to speak and persuade the multitude. So he's looking at the other arts that Socrates had mentioned. We skipped over some of them. He's saying it doesn't matter. All those arts, you don't need to have those arts, because if you have rhetoric, you can go to whoever has those arts and you can have them in your pocket, and you can have all the benefits of all the arts without needing to have them, just by using rhetoric to control people. So this is the answer that Gorgias is going to give, and as we'll see, his students are eating it up. They want to have freedom and they want to have power, and they're buying into this idea that if they learn rhetoric and they can use rhetoric to control people, then they can have everything they want in life, and that's going to be the good life. So is that wisdom? Is that, the greatest thing that there is, as Gorgias claims? Or is there something missing there? Is there something defective in this model of existence? That is the question that is raised by Socrates' question of what is rhetoric, and what is this rhetoric that Gorgias is teaching. So in the rest of the dialogue, we're going to look at how this plays out, and what Socrates thinks of this answer, and what he's going to propose as an alternative to it.